Why does God allow suffering? Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. There is a question that haunts the human spirit, a question that has echoed through the corridors of time, whispered in the silence of suffering, screamed in moments of despair. It is the question that arises when we witness tragedy, when we lose what we love, when we stand at the edge of chaos and stare into the abyss. Why does God allow suffering? Now, let's be clear, this is not a trivial question. It is not the sort of thing you ask lightly, and it is certainly not the sort of thing that can be answered with a mere platitude. To suffer is to encounter something fundamental about existence itself. It is to be exposed to reality in its most brutal and inescapable form. And if there is a God, if there is a moral structure to the universe, then suffering seems at first glance to be an intolerable contradiction. Imagine a world without suffering. A place where nothing ever goes wrong, where pain does not exist, where every challenge is erased before it even appears. At first glance, this might seem like paradise. But if we think deeply about it, if we really consider the consequences, we quickly realize that such a world would be unlivable, not because it would be too good, but because it would be entirely meaningless. Human beings are not designed for stagnation. We are wired to adapt, to overcome, to grow. And growth is inextricably linked to suffering. Every great achievement in human history, every act of courage, every moment of profound personal development has emerged from struggle. Without suffering, there is no friction. Without friction, there is no movement. Without movement, there is no progress. Consider how a child learns to walk. It is not a seamless, effortless process. It is a series of stumbles, of falls, of scraped knees and frustration. But through that process, the child develops balance, coordination, and resilience. Now, imagine if that struggle were removed. Suppose a machine carried the child everywhere, ensuring that they never experienced the pain of falling. The result would not be a stronger, more capable individual. It would be someone incapable of standing on their own. This principle scales up to every level of human existence. Those who have never faced adversity remain fragile. They lack the depth that comes from hardship. They do not know what they are capable of because they have never been tested. The greatest minds in history, the most admirable figures, the people who inspire us are not those who avoided suffering, but those who faced it head-on and emerged transformed. Their strength was not granted to them, it was earned. This is why suffering is not simply an unfortunate aspect of life, it is a fundamental aspect of being. It is the forge in which character is shaped, in which strength is developed, in which meaning is discovered. The idea that suffering should be removed entirely is not just naive, it is dangerous. It assumes that comfort is the highest good, that ease is preferable to challenge, that the absence of pain is the same as fulfillment. But this is not true. People who are handed everything without effort, who never struggle, who never have to push against difficulty, do not become better versions of themselves. They become weak, apathetic, and ultimately miserable. This is why those who have suffered deeply often possess a wisdom that others lack. They have confronted the hardest aspects of life and have come to understand that struggle is not an obstacle, it is the path. They have endured loss, failure, and despair, and yet they have continued forward. It is not because they enjoyed suffering, but because they recognized what it could produce. The most profound human virtues, courage, perseverance, compassion, are only developed in the presence of hardship. Even in nature, this truth is evident. Trees that grow in harsh conditions develop deeper roots. Muscles grow only when they are torn and rebuilt. Diamonds are formed under immense pressure. Strength, real, enduring strength, does not come from comfort. It comes from the ability to withstand suffering, to take what is painful and transform it into something valuable. The modern world often promotes the illusion that suffering should be avoided at all costs. That pain is merely an inconvenience, something to be medicated, ignored, or denied. But denying suffering does not eliminate it, it merely delays it. The avoidance of struggle does not make one stronger, it makes one more fragile. And when suffering inevitably arrives, as it must, those who have never learned to endure it are left defenseless. This does not mean that suffering is good in and of itself. It is not something to seek out for its own sake. But when it comes, as it always does, it presents a choice. Either one resists it, resents it, and is ultimately broken by it, or one accepts it, confronts it, and allows it to shape them into something greater. Suffering is an inevitable part of life, but its significance is not found in the mere fact that it exists. What truly matters is how we respond to it. Two people can endure the same hardship and emerge from it in entirely different ways, one broken, embittered, and lost, while the other grows in wisdom, strength, and purpose. The difference lies not in the suffering itself, but in the way it is confronted. Throughout history, the most admirable and inspiring figures are not those who lived lives of ease and comfort. They are the ones who suffered deeply and yet transformed that suffering into something meaningful. Their hardships did not define them in a way that led to despair. Rather, their response to hardship became the foundation upon which they built something greater. A person who loses everything and yet finds a way to rebuild is infinitely more inspiring than someone who has never been tested. The stories that resonate with us most, whether found in religious texts, literature, or history, are those of individuals who took suffering and used it to transcend their limitations. This is why the question of suffering is not merely about why it happens, but about what one chooses to do in the face of it. Some react with resentment, cursing existence itself for the unfairness of their circumstances. This reaction is understandable, but it is also destructive. It places the individual in a state of perpetual victimhood, where every hardship is viewed as an injustice rather than an opportunity for growth. Bitterness does not alleviate suffering, it amplifies it. When a person refuses to accept responsibility for how they respond to pain, they surrender control over their own life. But there is another path. There is the possibility of confronting suffering with courage, of seeing it not as an obstacle but as a test of character. A person who endures suffering and still chooses to act with integrity, who refuses to be broken by hardship, who transforms pain into something meaningful, that is a person who commands deep respect. This is why we admire those who suffer with dignity, the soldier who sacrifices for his comrades, the parent who endures sleepless nights to care for a sick child, the individual who loses everything but refuses to be consumed by despair. These are the people who embody the deepest truth about suffering, that meaning is not found in avoiding it but in how it is faced. One of the most powerful realizations a person can have is that suffering is not simply something that happens to them. It is something that calls forth a response. When hardship strikes, the question is not just why is this happening, but also what will I do about it? This shift in perspective is transformative. It moves a person from being a passive recipient of pain to an active participant in their own destiny. Those who accept this challenge begin to see that suffering, while painful, also holds the potential for growth. It is through difficulty that resilience is built. It is through struggle that depth is developed. This is why those who suffer deeply often emerge with a sense of purpose that others lack. The person who has lost everything and yet continues forward possesses a kind of wisdom that cannot be learned in comfort. They know in a way that others do not that life is not about the avoidance of pain, but about the ability to bear it well. They understand that suffering can either be a force that destroys or a force that refines, and the choice between those two outcomes is made in how one responds. Suffering, then, is not just a meaningless burden. It is an arena in which the deepest aspects of human character are revealed. It exposes weaknesses, but it also offers the opportunity to transcend them. It presents the possibility of despair, but also the opportunity for profound meaning. Those who respond to suffering with strength and courage do not merely endure life, they shape it. When suffering strikes, when chaos threatens to overwhelm, the natural instinct is to recoil, to withdraw, to question why such burdens must be borne at all. But suffering is not merely something that happens to us, it is something that demands a response. The question is not just whether we will suffer, because suffering is inevitable. The real question is whether we will let it crush us or whether we will take up responsibility in the face of it. Responsibility is the antidote to despair, the force that counteracts meaninglessness, the structure that allows a person to endure suffering without being consumed by it. To carry responsibility is to voluntarily take on the burden of existence rather than passively suffer under its weight. It is to choose consciously and deliberately to bear what is difficult and to do so with dignity. People who abandon responsibility often fall into resentment and bitterness. They blame the world, blame others, blame God. And while their suffering may be real, their refusal to carry responsibility ensures that they will remain trapped in it. When someone refuses responsibility, they become a victim not just of their circumstances, but of their own mindset. They relinquish their ability to change, to improve, to transcend. This is why people who take responsibility, even in the face of immense suffering, are often the ones who find meaning. A person who loses their job, experiences personal betrayal, or faces illness has every reason to despair. But those who respond by shouldering responsibility, by seeking to improve what they can, by carrying their suffering without inflicting it on others, by continuing forward despite hardship, often find that life becomes richer rather than emptier. The greatest figures in history are not those who had easy lives, but those who carried immense burdens and did so without surrendering to despair. There is something deeply admirable about those who take on responsibility voluntarily. The parent who sacrifices for their child, the worker who commits to their craft, the individual who chooses to do what is right even when it is difficult, these people inspire respect because they embody the deepest truth about life, that meaning is found in what we take responsibility for. And when people take responsibility for something beyond themselves, whether it be their family, their community, or a cause greater than their personal comfort, their suffering becomes bearable because it is given purpose. The alternative is nihilism. When responsibility is abandoned, life becomes arbitrary. Pain becomes nothing more than an unfortunate accident, and suffering becomes an argument for hopelessness. This is why those who refuse responsibility so often fall in despair. They see no reason to endure, no higher purpose to serve, no structure that gives their suffering context. They drift, aimless, resentful, waiting for someone else to fix the world or remove their burdens. But waiting does nothing. Suffering remains, and without responsibility, it festers, growing into something unbearable. Carrying responsibility does not mean that suffering disappears. It does not mean that hardship will cease. But it does mean that suffering is integrated into something meaningful rather than being a source of pure destruction. The weight of responsibility does not crush a person the way aimlessness does. In fact, it strengthens them. Those who take on responsibility become more resilient, more capable, more worthy of trust. They develop character in a way that those who seek only comfort never will. The act of carrying a heavy load willingly is what transforms a person from weak to strong, from uncertain to confident, from lost to grounded. This is why the burden of responsibility is not something to be avoided, but something to be embraced. It is the means through which suffering is made meaningful, the path through which chaos is ordered, the foundation upon which purpose is built. A person who carries responsibility does not merely endure suffering, they overcome it. Thanks for watching.